Donovan, coming to you live from the Ottawa Life Magazine podcast in downtown Ottawa, the capital of Canada. And we're very pleased this morning to do part two of our podcast, a very successful podcast that we did last summer with a Canadian lawyer and author, Andrew Iler, of course, who is the person behind Chokeholds, this incredible book about the JFK assassination. And Andrew is a subject matter expert on this, both, really globally. Certainly, he's recognized in the United States for his deep work and research into the JFK assassination, the JFK assassination records. And their book came out last year called Chokeholds, and we had a fascinating discussion about that. And we have the link in this podcast if you want to go back and replay that before listening to this one. And I had been planning on talking to Andrew last summer. We had been talking about having a meeting for some time, and then then it became, of course, very, very prescient because of the attempted assassination of Donald Trump during the primary when he was in the run-up to the presidency last year. And of course, since then, lots has happened. Set the stage here, Andrew. Mr. Trump got elected. He got of course, the Republicans won the House. They won the Senate. And of course, they won the presidency. And he very quickly, one of his promises was that he was going to release the JFK records. And Bobby Kennedy, who has been confirmed as the Secretary of Health of the United States, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is a brilliant lawyer himself. Now, the health minister said he wanted those records released as well with regards to the death of his father, of course, death of his uncle, President John F. Kennedy, and of course, his uncle, Robert Kennedy, the great former Attorney General of the United States, who was assassinated in the 1968 Democratic primary. I believe, Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, just after Martin Luther King was assassinated, a couple of months later, Bobby Kennedy, of course, in that ballroom in Los Angeles, was by Sierra and Sierra, I think the guy's name was. And of course, there's that famous Blue Rodeo song about this. Maybe Annalise will play that on the outtake today. But so all that to say, to set this up, Trump gets in. He releases these some documents, Andrew, but I want to start with you. If you can explain to us what he released, because I thought we were going to get, and I know this is complicated, and you're going to explain it for us, but I thought we were going to get like this information on what was being hidden. But apparently what we learned of the critical JFK records that were buried and ignored at the National Archives in the United States, there's millions of pages of records that Trump released. So now people like you have to go through this stuff. So take us from there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan. I think what happened on January 23rd, President Trump issued an executive order, and it didn't actually release anything. It ordered the Director of National Intelligence and other senior officials to go away for 15 days and come up with a new plan to release JFK records that have been withheld for 60 years or longer. And so what we've had are a series of plans to release these assassination records.
Hang on. Can I just stop you there? Because this is my curiosity. Okay, so he said he was going to release the documents about the JFK thing. And I'm just trying to get the process here, Andrew. So then he doesn't. They released something else. They released all these other records, right?
No, they haven't released anything, Dan. That what his executive order states is he did send his acting director of national intelligence and people from the Department of Justice away to come up with a plan to release the remaining withheld records. So nothing at all was released since President Trump took office on January 20th. It's just been a promise to create a new plan. And that's the problem.
Hang on, because this sounds to me, I mean, we talked about your book called Chokeholds. This is like a chokehold, like a bureaucratic thing on process and system. Can you explain to us, like, who is behind all of this
obfuscation,
analysis paralysis, process hold? I even find it confusing. Like if he says he's gonna release the documents and then they don't that, so you get this idea that he's releasing it, but then you say he hasn't released anything. So what was the whole executive order? Was that like some kind of a farce, or was that some kind of a ghost play, or what?
No, I don't think so. I think what's happening is that the president sees these records as some kind of bargaining chip or leverage that he has over the intelligence community, mainly the Central Intelligence Agency. And so
Hang
really,
on. So to stop there for a second. Why, 63 years after the fact, would the Central Intelligence Agency or the intelligence community in the United States still be doing this? Why would they not want? Why would they be being difficult about this? Wouldn't they want this stuff released now?
I think there's a lot of information in these records that has still not been disclosed. The American public really doesn't have a clear idea about a lot of the information that surrounded the assassination. So I think a number of agencies, you just heard the week after the executive order, the FBI, or 2 weeks after, the FBI came out and disclosed that they had 2,400 files with 14,000 pages of documents that they knew about, that by law they were supposed to hand over to the Assassination Records Review Board in the 1990s, and they held it back, and they didn't hand those records over, and they were never disclosed, which they were required to be disclosed by law back in the 1990s. And all of a sudden, in early February, it's discovered that these records exist. And so, listen, that's not the only agency that's holding records back. There are records still from the Church Committee that have not been disclosed. There's records at the CIA that clearly have not been disclosed, that no one is even aware of.
Can I just stop you there for a sec? So, because you're raising some sort of cogent points here, and so this is where my sort of journalist / writer hat goes on, and I sort of go to the verb, which is, it sounds to me like this is a process where the intelligence community, and I'm not one who believes in sort of the deep state kind of thing. I think parts of that exist, but and obviously with this you can make a good case that it does. But it seems to me like they're just trying to bury people in paperwork. Like it's like smother them in paper, and it's like a deflection to get people off the verb, which is what really happened. Now, you're like a subject matter expert on this. You have probably researched this more than probably, like, if we were to say 5 people that have researched this, you're one of the 5. You know the documents, you know the process, you know the commissions after the assassination, you know about what the, when the official report came out in the 70s about what really happened, which everybody knows was a lie. I mean, you know this stuff. So my question to you is, given what you're seeing right now, what do you think really happened?
In terms of, there's 2 views of this. Like, one is what happened in the actual assassination. I'm less of an expert.
Let's start with that. What
on
do
that
you,
area,
Andrew Iler, think really happened?
I think it's pretty.
And by the way, I should say to our listeners, as a lawyer, okay, I know you're like risk adverse and you want to be precise because you want, but I'm asking you just for a second to set that aside, because I get you've got to stick to the material, but based on the evidence that you have seen in years of researching this, the discovery, if you will, Andrew Iler's discovery, what do you think is going on here? What do you think happened?
Dan, in the last chapter of JFK Assassination Chokeholds, we lay out, and it's the largest chapter in the book, 60 years of.
With the new documents, like, I recognize that, but go ahead. But I want you to explain that to the listeners, which I know that component, but the listeners don't, so we should do that. But based on, since then, with this new release of documents, Has it reinforced your view, or has it changed something? How's that?
Yeah, no, like I said, the last chapter of our book is titled 60 Years of Obstruction of Justice. And what we do in that chapter is we lay out like a massive pile of evidence that shows that the government, from whatever it was, the autopsy to the initial investigation, the various commissions and investigations of the assassination, right from the first minute after the bullets rang out in Dealey Plaza, there's been a systematic obstruction of each investigation and a lot of evidence suppression right from the very beginning. And so what do I think happened? I don't know. More than one shooter was on Dealey Plaza. I think that's almost an absolute given at this point. But what we can show is that various agencies and elements of the government have done everything that they can to suppress the truth from coming out. And what I say is, what I think doesn't really matter. What the government really needs to do is the Department of Justice has enough information now, enough probable cause, that they could order the exhumation and a proper forensic examination of the president, and within 5 minutes, they could determine whether all the bullets came from behind or whether there were front entrance wounds, particularly to the president's head. This idea is distasteful, but the fact is 62 years have gone by, and if you want to determine whether there was a multiple shooter situation and not just a lone nut, that's the only thing that we should be doing right now. There's a new government commission, a task force in Washington that's looking into this. The first thing that I would do is I would approach the Department of Justice and ask for a proper forensic examination of President Kennedy's remains.
Have you done that, or have your team or the people you're working with done that? Or do you intend to do that based on the release of the new documents?
Yes. So again, no new documents have been released yet, and we are putting significant pressure on the task force to actually release. There's a certain set of documents, and this is where my expertise has really focused in the last 3 years. There was a board created in the 1990s called the Assassination Records Review Board. Their job was to collect, review, and release all government records regarding the assassination. And they did a massive job. They collected over 4 million pages of documents. And for each document and redactions within those documents, the ARB issued separate orders, like legal orders, to either review the documents in the future, or in a lot of cases, to release those documents on certain dates. And what I found, I went down to the National Archives last November, and I asked to see all of these records. In total, there should be over 30,000 of these legal orders. They're on paper, they're digitized, and again, for each record, they issue a legal order on the disposition of these records. Okay, and what I found, I was only given access to 450 of these final determinations or final legal orders. And a lot of these orders ordered the actual assassination records released in the mid-2000s. And when I cross-referenced those legal orders to the actual assassination records, it became very, very clear that these legal orders were not complied with. They haven't been accessible to the American public. And it's pretty shocking to see that, thousands of legal orders were essentially ignored and they were buried.
Okay, so let me just try to clarify something here, because I usually have seen in the different stories and investigations and things I've written over the last 27 years that usually when you get into a problem like this, you follow the money. Okay, you follow the money. What I mean by that is this: if you have legal orders in the United States related to these records, that means that to file or to get a legal order, there's a cost to that. Like somebody has to pay to file that, right? So who would be paying to file these orders in the court? Is it the Justice Department? And if it's the Justice Department, who in the Justice Department is signing for that? Like
Yeah, so
he's
just to explain it a little bit better, out of the law that was created in 1992 after Oliver Stone's movie, it's the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992. Out of that, they created an administrative agency. So it's an independent agency that had the power of the law to issue subpoenas and to make final determinations and issue these orders with regard to the records. So it's an independent federal agency that was given power to issue these orders, Dan.
But the people at that agency, though, here's where I'm going with this: the people at that agency would have access to the information. They would be reading the information, and then they would be deciding that the public shouldn't have access to it. So who are those people? Like it can be an independent board, but that's somebody, right? I mean, who was selected for that board? Who's the person? Who's the person then that got access to this information? Said, well, we're not sharing this.
Yeah, there were very stringent standards under the act on what that board could, what they call postpone or withhold from the public. It was very, very tightly controlled, and they released a large majority of the information. The stuff that they withheld really did meet a very high standard for national security issues or disclosing names of agents or foreign relations that really, there's justification that they couldn't make it public back in the 1990s. And I got to say, that board, the Assassination Records Review Board, they did an excellent job. The fault on not complying with the orders really rests with National Archives, who's been the custodian of these records and had separate duties from the board under the act. It's a little bit complex in terms of the relationships and the legal duties. The board wound up its operations in 1998, and after that, they had no responsibility to enforce their own orders. That was really left to the National Archives, the agency, and the President of the United States. Those three entities really had the responsibility with regard to all the rest of those records.
So the National Archives, so someone at the National Archives has these records that have been resting with them since 1998, and the National Archives, they have to adjudicate the release of records based on certain certain legislation. I would say they have rules. So that means that somebody at the National Archives made a decision that this stuff wasn't going to be released.
Well, I mean, it's either that or they forgot about it. And it's a little bit difficult to forget about the John F. Kennedy assassination records because they're the most sought after records in the archives. And so, again, we're talking about two different kinds of documents. One are the legal orders that control the actual records, right? And so what I've really focused on and uncovered are thousands of these legal orders that really weren't complied with over the last 30 years. And I've tried to raise this and make people aware in the U.S. government, and hopefully this information falls in to the right hands on the task force and they take a good look at it. Because listen, if I were on this task force, I would do two things. One, I just previously mentioned, I would ask the Department of Justice to seek a proper forensic examination to clear up the cause of death once and for all. And the second thing I would do is the second thing I would do, Dan, just let me finish my thought, is that I would absolutely order the National Archives to make public all 37,000 of these final determinations, because the American people spent tens of millions of dollars back in the 90s going over all of these records with a fine-tooth comb, and an agency made orders with regard to all of the records. So why don't we follow that agency that actually took a good look at it?
So let's just go through each of those 2 points, Andrew. The first one I find kind of curious. I've read your book. I've actually read a lot of material on the Kennedy assassination over the years. In my life, I've watched I've watched the narrative of that association sort of inculcate itself in our culture, in theater and movies, all over in Seinfeld, I
Yeah.
mean, it's been used, it's become a cultural thing, the assassination. Everybody knows something about it. But one thing I'm a little surprised, if you could just sort of extrapolate on this a bit, because you've said that the first thing that they should do is exhume the body and have another forensic examination of the assassinated president's remains. Now, I must have missed something, because I was not aware that I always thought the forensic evidence, because there's all these discussions about the bullets, right, plural. I always thought that since the Warren Commission, and certainly since the things that have happened in the 90s, that it was just a given that everybody knows there was more than one shooter. And I also thought that the forensic evidence that already came out showed that, they had the suggestion it was one shooter. It also clearly showed that's insane. There's just no way, because there are all these stories and books and things written about the trajectory of the bullet, and that there's no way that bullet could have ricocheted and done that angle and then hit, was it Connolly, the governor, and so are you saying that you think that if they exhume the president, they exhume the former president's body, that there'd be new medical evidence that would actually prove that there was more than one bullet outside of what you have?
So, Dan, the difficulty is, immediately after the assassination, the president was taken to Parkland Hospital in Dallas. Okay. And you had a crack team of extremely experienced trauma doctors treating the president, including two neurosurgeons. One of them was the chair of neurosurgery at Southwestern Medical School. And a massive number of these expert trauma doctors said that there was a large baseball-sized hole in the back of the president's head. Okay. An autopsy was supposed to happen in Dallas. By law, when a death happens, the autopsy is supposed to happen in the district where the murder took place. Okay, that never happened. They took the president's body, put it on Air Force One, and brought it back to Washington, D.C., where an autopsy was conducted at Bethesda Military Medical Hospital under military control. And if there's one thing that everyone in the assassination research community, whether on one side you're a lone nut conspiracist, Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone, or you're the most wild thinking conspiracy theorist, everyone agrees that the military autopsy was the most flawed failure of an actual autopsy, and all of its findings are put into question because the autopsy was done so poorly. Now, what really is shocking, and this came out in the 1990s as a result of the documents that the Assassination Records Review Board uncovered, and they did sworn depositions of many of the Bethesda autopsy staff. The American public was told that the autopsy completely dismissed the evidence and testimony of the doctors in Dallas. Okay. But in the 1990s, what came out is that they had actually suppressed the evidence of the Bethesda medical staff, who many of them testified that they also saw a hole in the back of the president's head. But the official report said no hole in the back of the president's head. So there's a real discrepancy out of the official autopsy that goes completely contrary to both the doctors in Dallas who treated the president after the shooting and the medical staff. And that's why I think there's enough probable cause for the Department of Justice to seek a court order to do a proper forensic examination. I mean, this would have happened if it wasn't the Kennedy assassination. This would have been done decades ago.
So, two observations, Andrew, and one of the challenges with this discussion sometimes is that there's a lot known. There's by a lot of people. There's a lot of assumptions made about the assassination, some not known. So I just want to try to clarify something. So my understanding is that the reason, and this is a little morbid, but it's a fact, and it's in the video, it's in the film of the incident, everything. That when the president was shot, Jackie Kennedy got on the back of the limousine. She's crawling up over the seat on the the trunk of the limo, and it was a reactive thing. And this is kind of morbid, but apparently she saw a piece of the president's skull or on the back of the, and she went onto the back of the trunk to grab that. That's one of the accounts that I read. I mean, it's a shocking, awful thing. So that would be consistent with, he got shot in the head, obviously, and if you get shot in the head and
front,
your skull. But here's the thing: like, is it really on one level improper or outrageous to think that I get, there's the local law that in Dallas or in any other city, there's a rule, if someone's shot or murdered, there has to be an autopsy. That's part of the law. On the other hand, it's the president of the United States. I could see from that perspective why the people in the White House and in national security would say, secure the scene, get the president out of there, bring him back. We're gonna do an autopsy. Like they just lock down everything and secure everything. And that would have to permission for that at that point would have to come from the vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was sworn in on the plane from, on his way to coming back from Dallas, I believe, to Washington. But I mean, do those decisions to me, seem understandable given the severity of what happened. I could see the administration saying, secure the body, secure the scene, get him out of there.
Yeah. So if I can make one comment, one of the main sets of documents that are being withheld are the lengthy interviews that Jackie Kennedy did with a journalist named William Manchester. And they did several hours of taped interviews. And those interviews, the content of those interviews have been held by the Kennedy family in secret for 62 years. And
who did the interview?
William Manchester.
Interview with a government official?
No, William Manchester did. He was a journalist. And when you mentioned Jackie Kennedy's awful experience in the limousine and jumping out onto the trunk, what many people believe is that she explains that in detail in these interviews that were done by William Manchester. And again, the content of all of those hours of tape and the transcription have been withheld from the American public since November 1963. Those are some of the probably more sensational, but also more instructive records that the public has not seen or heard.
So are you saying that that's a Kennedy family thing?
They are being withheld.
Or the journalist just withheld them as well?
Well, the Kennedy family has provided those records by deed of gift to the National Archives under the condition that they not be released. And so at some point in the future, Carolyn Kennedy or another member of the Kennedy family may have the decision to release those records. But I think those records are pretty critical to understanding from a key eyewitness in the car what they experienced, what they saw, what they heard. And we have not heard anything of what's in those records.
Now, I'll tell you what's interesting about that to me, Andrew. So Carolyn Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, Carolyn Kennedy, the daughter of the assassinated president, and her cousin, Robert Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's currently the Trump, has been named the Secretary of Health. Now, obviously, they don't get along because the Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, F. Kennedy Jr. said, all families are dysfunctional. The Carolyn Kennedy and a group of the Kennedys went out of their way to diss Bobby Kennedy when he was running for the independent run for the Democratic primary. And then when he joined Trump, they had a press conference and said, this guy, we don't want him to be in here. He shouldn't be in public office, yada, yada. She came out just again a couple of weeks ago, just really going at him, saying he should never be the Secretary of Health. Now, myself, I just completely disagree with that. I think he's a brilliant man. But the point is, they obviously don't agree on a lot of things. And you can only imagine when it comes to the discussion around the assassination of her father. And actually, this also involves the assassination of his father, the president's brother, Robert Kennedy, in 1968. So my point is this. What you're saying, if I understand this, is that this interview between Carolyn Kennedy's mother, Jackie Onassis Kennedy, and this reporter sheds a lot of light on some real important details on this. They would not release that interview to the public, but what they did do is give that information in that interview to the National Archives.
That's
the
correct.
National Archives have refused to release it. And now we have the Secretary of Health, Robert Kennedy Jr., who's saying he wants all this stuff released. But Carolyn Kennedy's still alive, and she would be saying, that's not being released. Like that's a whole other dynamic in this, isn't it?
Yeah, the law specifies that deeds of gift are not controlled by the JFK Records Act. And so the person who has the decision making over those interviews is Carolyn Kennedy, because she's the last.
And folks, I just want to say, so Andrew is like a really excellent lawyer. I've worked with him on some other things. He's really sharp. And so what you're quoting here is case law. I would suggest that you're saying that at the end of the day, the decision on this is hers, correct?
Hers alone.
Not the archives.
Yeah, Carolyn Kennedy has complete control over all of the records that were transferred to archives under deed of gift under the 1992 law.
Do you think from your knowledge, Andrew, and the research you have done, that what was disclosed, and we don't obviously, I mean, we can assume what may have been disclosed in that interview with Jackie Onassis and the reporter, but do you think that information has been disclosed elsewhere? For example, at any point, did Jackie Kennedy sit down with government investigators or the police and share the same kind of information that you know of?
Yeah, Jackie Kennedy testified to the Warren Commission. I believe it was in closed session. There's some of that testimony is available, but I think she provided much more detail to William Manchester in the hours of taped interviews that they did. Now, listen, I mean, Dan, this is like a tragedy of such enormous proportions, both JFK and RFK Sr., what happened to them in the 1960s. I can't put myself in the shoes of Carolyn Kennedy or RFK Jr. They both are coming at things from very, very different points. And so Carolyn Kennedy probably has very good reasons that the American public is not aware of why she doesn't want to disclose these records. They're very protective of Jackie Kennedy's legacy and definitely of John F. Kennedy's legacy. So there are reasons that we can't fathom. But I think for the American public, the overriding interest is knowing the truth about what happened in 1963. And I think the American people are having a hard time moving on and trusting their government in large part because of the secrecy around the assassination.
So, and again, that makes a lot of sense to me, and which actually is why when we talk about the Kennedy assassination, we talk to people like you who have got the breadth of knowledge about some of the minutiae and detail of it. So, I'd like to get your opinion on some. Like, I just find it fascinating, and and obviously you can only provide a subjective answer, but why would somebody? I'm trying to understand this. Why would Carolyn Kennedy, or sorry, why would Jackie Onassis Kennedy? Why would Jackie Kennedy sit down with a reporter, a writer, get into the weeds and the detail about so much of this information, and then knowing it's a media person, it's a reporter, so obviously someone she trusted, because I'm sure that's why she sat down with that person, but then only to say after, but it's never to be released. Like that to me, I'm just what is that?
Yeah.
How do you explain that? Is there a way from what you've seen to explain that?
Yeah, I do understand. Both Robert Kennedy Sr. and Jackie Kennedy and other members of the Kennedy family, including Ted Kennedy, have had two different views of the assassination. One is their public statements and public views, and many of them said, we support the findings of the Warren Commission. But in private, it's been documented, and it's quite clear that most of them never believed the Warren Commission. And
so why would they say they did publicly? Just tell the listeners why you think they would say that publicly.
I think they were under immense personal and external pressure to not rock the boat at that very tumultuous time in history. They had no power. And in the United States, really everything revolves around who has power. And if they started to cry out from the wilderness that that elements of the government or the CIA or the military or some operation involved with those elements was part of the assassination, they were quite aware of the power of these agencies and government institutions, and they didn't stand a chance. They all had large families, they had children, that and interests that they wanted to protect, and I think that was part of the reason why Robert Kennedy Sr. ran for president in 1968. He was very, very quietly committed to actually reopening the investigation into his brother's death. And when he was assassinated, I really think it drove the point home to the entire Kennedy family that it's better just to stay quiet and go along, find different interests to pursue. And that's why Jackie Kennedy probably did this interview for historical purposes, wanting to protect her children.
Sure, it makes sense. I get that. That actually makes
Wanting to leave something for later historians to better understand what actually happened in that limo.
So we've just to go back to your 2 points you raised earlier. So we talked about the first one, which was the exhuming the body to have the medical record reviewed and an autopsy with regards to the bullet wounds, etc. And then the second point you raised is that you think that there have to be some actions taken by the Justice Department moving forward.
Well, Congresswoman Luna from Florida has been named chair of a task force in Congress to investigate a whole bunch of things. I think their focus is a little wide ranging for the short period of time. They have 6 months, Dan, to investigate the JFK assassination, the assassinations of Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, 9/11, COVID origins, the Epstein files, and I think there's maybe one or two other things in a 6-month period. And I mean, 6 months isn't even enough time to really fully grasp all the problems with the Kennedy assassinations, let alone all those other issues. The one thing that I think Congresswoman Luna and her task force need to do as I've said repeatedly, the Assassination Records Review Board back in the 1990s did the most thorough job that you can comprehend. It was painstaking. They took 4 years to do it. They looked at every single record. Hey, why don't we start by releasing all the legal orders that disposed of those records? Make them public. Put them up on National Archives website. Unbury them so that the American people and the archivist and the president can understand that this job has already been done 30 years ago. And let's see what they ordered, because I think what they will find, no, I know what they will find. They will find that the ARRB issued orders specifically releasing a lot of these records, and a lot of those orders were not complied with. So let's just get that lined up. And then there may be some fragments left that can be dealt with. But if this task force moved on those two issues, it would just, it might only take 6 months to start clearing up a lot of the confusion and mess that's been left.
And so on that, Andrew, and on a final note, and we're going to have you back again because this is an ongoing story of the public interest. People are really interested in this in terms of what's going to happen next. How hopeful are you that what you've just articulated is going to happen in the coming months?
Yeah, government, whether it's in the United States or Canada, government usually ends up disappointing people. What I do hope is that in the next few months, that whether it's by mistake, inadvertence, or whether it's intentional, that new information does emerge from this task force. That usually is what happens each time the government has investigated the assassination. New information emerges. Oftentimes it's by mistake. And so that would be the least that I hope for. We're following this closely, Dan. Your listeners can check us out on Twitter or X at JFK Chokeholds. We've got a great website that we update a lot of information at jfkchokeholds.com. And but we're very active on X, and we have quite a few great posts in details, especially recently about the discovery of these legal orders that were issued back in the 1990s.
Well, folks, on that note, we're going to end this particular podcast on the JFK assassination and the follow-up. And Andrew, we look forward to having you back. Of course, Andrew Iler is the subject matter expert on the JFK assassination, and the book Chokeholds is fascinating. I think for anyone who wants to familiarize himself with the complexity of this case, it's really worth reading that book. And it's a great segue into what's happening now. And we'll be following in coming months, Andrew, certainly what happens with the Trump administration. I'm particularly interested to see what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is going to do with regards to all of this. And we will look forward to having you back on our podcast again, if you're willing to come back, so we can see what the next chapter in this ongoing saga brings us. So I'd like to thank you for coming on the show again today, Andrew. It's really appreciated.